All right, well, it is 5 o'clock, so we will get started. And I am Krista with the International Wolf Center. So thank you so much for joining us for our presentation on the sea wolves of Alaska tonight. And we are really excited to have everyone here and for Ellen to have joined us. And so just a few reminders that this webinar is being recorded. So you will be getting the link to the recording within a few days of this original broadcast. And then you can ask your questions on the Q&A tab. You can type them in at any point during the presentation, but we'll kind of save them up and ask them all at the end out loud for Ellen to answer live during our webinar. And like I said, we'll be sending out that link with the recording so you can watch it again and again if you would like. So thanks again for joining us. And then we have Grant Spickelmeyer, our Executive Director, who's going to give you a little bit more information on Ellen.
All right, thanks, Krista. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, or maybe morning for some of our international folks. This is a presentation I'm really excited to share with all of you. It's a presentation I got to see in the Wolves Across Borders conference in Stockholm, Sweden this spring. And I think it's somewhat ironic that I had to travel to Stockholm, Sweden to meet somebody from Minneapolis, Minnesota. But that's great. It's kind of how the wolf world works, I guess. But Ellen is a PhD student and researcher who's doing some really interesting stuff. And I'm just going to read a little bit from her bio and then let her take over. But so Ellen was born here in Minneapolis and was inspired to study the natural world by childhood camping trips up in the Boundary Waters canoe area, which it sounds like she's coming to do another one of those in August. She received her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences from Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, where she worked on research projects with urban coyotes, salamanders, and bumblebees. And then Ellen lived for 14 months in northern Norway, so that wasn't your first Scandinavian visit last spring, to study Arctic fox conservation. And she's now an NSF-funded PhD student in wildlife sciences at Oregon State University, which is the beavers, for those of you who are following, not the ducks. You don't want to get those two mixed up if you're in Oregon. And her dissertation research is focused primarily on using non-invasive genetic methods to study the foraging ecology of animals such as coastal wolves in Alaska and wildcats in Mesoamerica, which is crazy to think you're using the same techniques with both species. She's also, just because, why not, conducting side projects with Central American scarlet macaws and northern sea otters. And in her very limited free time, Ellen enjoys reading fiction, making collages, listening to podcasts, rock climbing, surfing, and rollerblading. I'm just tired now reading all of that, but I'm really excited. And thanks so much for joining us today, Ellen.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in for the webinar today. I'm really excited to share with you some of my ongoing dissertation work, which is focused on the really unique foraging ecology of these coastal wolves living on the Alaska Peninsula. Before we dive in, I wanted to acknowledge my main collaborators for this work, which are Kelsey Griffin at the Ocean Alaska Science and Learning Center through the National Park Service, and Gretchen Roffler with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, as well as my endlessly supportive advisor, Tal Levy. So our story starts in Katmai National Park and Preserve, which is located in Southwest Alaska, right across from Kodiak Island. Katmai is most commonly known for its iconic fat brown bears, which congregate at Brooks Falls in the park's interior to feed on the sockeye salmon return every year. However, Katmai also has nearly 500 miles of rugged coastline that is separated from the rest of the park by the Aleutian Range and thus only accessible by boat or bush plane. These coastal environments are characterized by deep fjords, which end in large open sedge meadows and host some of the highest brown bear densities in the world during the early summer months, especially June. But the Katmai coast is also home to an enigmatic population of coastal wolves. This photo here represents the impetus for my research. In 2016, the park's coastal biologist observed this wolf carrying a sea otter carcass down the beach. And she wasn't the only one who saw this. Wolves were observed with sea otter carcasses at several different sites on the Katmai coast, including on some small offshore islands. Now, I'm going to digress for just a second here to provide some important context for these sightings, which is that sea otters have recently reoccupied the Katmai coast after being nearly extirpated by from the Gulf of Alaska by the maritime fur trade in the 1800s. Then in the 1960s, in an attempt to stimulate sea otter population recovery, some individuals from a remnant population in the Aleutian Islands were translocated to Southeast Alaska by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And this figure here shows their historic range pre-fur trade in yellow, overlaid by their current range in purple. If we look at coastal wolf populations in Southeast Alaska, where sea otters were initially reintroduced, we see that there is some precedent for consumption of marine mammals by wolves. There's some super cool research in the region led by Gretchen Roffler and Charlotte Erickson, who recently published a cool paper in PNAS that you should check out if you can. And this paper and their work has described extensive sea otter consumption by island wolves, even when their traditional prey options of deer are still available. So given the rapid recolonization of sea otters across Alaska and the fact that we're seeing some of these island wolf packs in Southeast Alaska already taking advantage of the increasingly available marine prey, I wanted to characterize the diet of these mainland coastal wolves in Southwest Alaska, starting with the Katmai coast, where sea otters are abundant, and the only ungulate prey option is a low-density moose population. So they don't have any caribou or deer in Katmai, on the coast at least. And ultimately, I'm hoping to determine how marine resource utilization might shape different aspects of the population ecology of these wolves, like their population numbers and their territory distributions. The bulk of my sample collection for this investigation was conducted in the summer of 2021, from June through September, and even into early October, we did some sampling trips. We were able to sample 6 distinct locations on the Katmai coast and actually added a 7th site in 2022 as well. We accessed all of these sites with small planes that would land us and our gear on these narrow strips of beach. And then we base camped near fresh water while conducting the sampling. Needless to say, these field sites were some of the most beautiful places I have ever camped in my life. This photo here was my favorite of all, which was out on Cape Douglas. All of our research methods for this project were what we would call non-invasive methods, which just means that they don't involve capturing or otherwise harassing any of the wildlife in order to obtain the data. There are pros and cons to this style of research, but one of the obvious pros, especially when working in a national park like Katmai, is that you don't condition the animals to run and hide from people if you aren't trapping and darting them. So by using non-invasive research methods, we sort of maintain this relationship between the wolves and the park visitors that allows for really unique and special viewing opportunities. One super common non-invasive method for studying wildlife that many of you are probably already familiar with is camera trapping. This involves using automatic digital camera installations like those in these photos here to monitor wildlife activity. These are some of the setups I deployed for the project on the Katmai coast, and about half of them got demolished by brown bears. So there are definitely limitations to this method as well. A lot of our camera trapping work ends up being useful just for having amazing videos like this one of the animals that we're studying, because then I get to share them in presentations like this and sort of get people excited about the research. And also we can get really good looks at the individual wolves that can be useful later on. The videos are also useful for a variety of other things. For example, they can provide us with insights into the demographic composition of specific wolf packs. When we get a high quality video of a certain individual, we can often take note of their coat patterning and coloration, and then recapture or reobserve the same individual on cameras at different sites. And if you're lucky enough, like we were with this video here, to capture them peeing on camera, then you can actually tell their sex as well. For example, in this video, we now know that this wolf is a female because of the way she pees. Camera trap videos are also very useful for providing us with minimum counts of the number of individual wolves in a pack. For example, we see 5 adults together in this video, which lets us know that we should expect to see at least 5 unique individual wolves in our samples when we analyze the DNA later on. And this counting technique also applies to puppies. If we're lucky enough to get them on the camera after they are born and come out of the den in the early summer, then we can know without having to actually go on the den site and go into the den where the pups are, how many pups each pack had at a minimum. So you can see some really cute wolf pups in this video here. And then in a subsequent video from the same pack, we see the pups have aged a bit, and we actually see that there are 3 individuals now showing up in the video. And last but not least, we can use these camera trap videos to document some of the prey that the wolves are eating. So we get information from this before we even start with the genetic methods. For example, in this video, we had confirmation that the Katmai coastal wolves are eating salmon because we see that this wolf is bringing a salmon back to its den site. And this video happens really fast, but we can see here that the wolf is carrying the carcass of an Arctic ground squirrel in her mouth when she runs by. Another non-invasive method that we use to acquire samples is that it's called hair snaring, and we use it specifically to get hair samples for our genetic analysis. This involves wrapping barbed wire around a fallen log or a tree stump and then baiting the log itself with a scent lure. We use mostly Carmen's Mega Musk, which is a lure that a lot of trappers use. And the scent lure is really stinky. You don't want it to explode all over your luggage. That has happened to me before. And it prompts a scratch and rub response from curious wolves. When they rub up against the barbed wire on the log, they leave tufts of their fur behind for us to collect. And then if we're lucky enough to get a high quality, follicle component from those hairs, we can use the DNA there to do analysis downstream. And here's another nice video of a wolf showing that scratch and rub response. This method is also useful because when we pair it with a camera trap, we can associate a visual identity for the individual wolf with their genetic identity from the hair sample. So when I took the hair off of this log, I knew it was associated with this camera trap video. And now when I obtain diet data for that individual wolf, I'll know that it was this white female from the pack at Hallow Bay. And the main problem we have with the hair snaring is that bears are more often than not the first ones on the scene, and they can be very destructive of the hair snare setups. And they also leave their hair behind, which can contaminate the sample and be difficult to tell apart from the wolf hair sometimes. I love this video though. They're just so funny. And most of our time in the field and sort of the core of this project is spent trying to collect as much scat as possible. And these samples are the basis, of course, for our diet analysis for the wolves, and also tend to be the #1 source of genetic material for our individual wolf identities as well. And I'll discuss those methods in more depth in a little bit here. So we're always looking for the main use areas of these wolf packs when we're on the ground, which are their den and rendezvous sites, because these are a gold mine of wolf poop, hair, saliva, and other genetic materials. They also help us make some assumptions about what individual wolves are included together in a pack, because when we detect their scats together on a den or together at a rendezvous site, we can pretty safely assume that they are members of the same social group. We never go onto the den sites while the wolves are using them. So the dens in these photos that we found had already been moved off of by the wolves by the time that we got to them. I am just personally not comfortable going, up on dens that have pups in them, and it's not really necessary for the methods that we use anyway. And when the wolves move off of their dens, they go to these rendezvous sites, which are usually nearby the den and pretty big, open areas where the pups can have a little bit more independence while they're playing and still be supervised by older members of the pack. Here's a photo of one that was pretty much right on the beach, which is very emblematic of the, sea wolf idea. And there's another photo, you can tell it's a rendezvous site by all of the wolf signs. So there's scat everywhere, tracks everywhere, and particularly tracks of the puppies. Now, I want you all to be able to appreciate how neat our genetic methods are. So I'm going to do a little crash course on how DNA works. Some of you may already know, some of you might not. I'll keep it really brief. You might have heard people use the phrase genetic code before when talking about DNA. And this code refers to the 4 nitrogenous bases that can bind with one another to form the ladder structure of DNA's famous double helix. So that's on the left here, the sequence of A's, G's, C's, and T's that comprise DNA combine to contain all the information that makes every single life form unique. And that's our genetic code. So the genetic methods that we use in our research work by using a complex machine called a DNA sequencer to actually read the sequence of nitrogenous bases of the DNA within a scat or a hair sample. So, we put our DNA samples into the machine and it prints out into the computer like A, T, G, C, C, T, 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 G, like for hundreds and hundreds of letters. And then we can reference that sequence or reference an online database such as the NCBI GenBank to match that sequence from our sample with previously published sequences for specific species such as wolves. Now, fecal DNA metabarcoding is the genetic method that we're using to study wolf diet in this project. This method allows us to identify individual prey items by reading the sequences of the prey DNA left behind within a wolf scat. So the wolf's own DNA is present in the scat as well, but we're able to distinguish all of the individual species within one sample from one another by focusing our sequencing on a specific barcode region that is variable across species, hence the name DNA metabarcoding. So in this image on the top here, those black boxes are the shared, sequence areas between all of the species, and then the area in between is variable. So that area in between is the barcode that we read to identify individual species. The other way that we use DNA sequence data to answer questions about wolves is a method called SNP genotyping. Now, SNP is short, SNP, SNP is short for single nucleotide polymorphism, which just refers to the single base pair differences between the DNA sequences of individual wolves. These SNPs are distributed widely across the genome, and when we examine several of them together, it allows us to assemble a unique code or a genotype for every single wolf. You can sort of think of this as their unique genetic fingerprint. This information also tells us the sex of the wolf that we are looking at, because one of the SNPs that we target is located on the Y chromosome and thus is only present in males. So here's just a screenshot of what it looks like on my end when I get all of these data back. It's just, a sequence of letters that I then categorize by individual wolf. So all of the different colors in this image are unique individual wolves, and every column is a single scat sample. So you can see some wolves we have 4 scats from, some we have 5 scats from. And then we can map these genotyped scats based on the GPS location of where we collected them. And this, isn't as nice as like collar data is for estimating the home area of a wolf. But since we aren't able to collar our wolves, this is the next best thing for estimating where pack territories are, where the boundaries are between different packs, and also for making assumptions about which wolves are associated with one another. Like I mentioned with the den sites, when we detect a bunch of wolves kind of clustered together, we can pretty safely assume that those wolves are in the same family group. So back to the field, we were able to cover a lot of ground at all of our sites and ultimately collected over 800 wolf scats during our 4-month field season in Katmai. Those are marked in red on this map here. 545 of these samples contained both high-quality wolf DNA and vertebrate prey DNA. Now we're going to look at the results for our study of Katmai coastal wolf diet. We detected an average of 1.67 unique prey items per one wolf scat, which means that most of the time, wolves are eating more than one meal per bowel movement. Overall, we detected 67 unique species across all of these wolf scats combined, which is a pretty astounding dietary diversity, especially when you think of a wolf as like an obligate deer predator, like deer and beavers are all that they eat. That's definitely not the case for these wolves in coastal Alaska. In this figure, the y-axis on the left is going to show you the names of the different prey species that we detected in wolf diet, while the x-axis at the bottom is going to represent the number of scats that each prey item was detected within. So you can sort of think of this number as the number of wolf meals that included that specific prey species. The red bars are going to represent prey items that come from the terrestrial system, while the blue bars will be marine prey items. So first of all, we see that the wolves are eating some moose and that they're also taking advantage of some typical terrestrial alternate prey options like beaver and Arctic ground squirrels. We also see brown bear showing up in their diet, which is pretty neat. This observation is corroborated by some anecdotes that park visitors shared with us while we were working out on the coast that summer of wolf packs hunting down brown bear cubs and spring cubs in particular. One of my favorite stories we were told is that there was a mother brown bear with her 2 cubs feeding out on the mud flats, and then the tide came in and the 2 cubs got isolated from mom on a little mud island that got separated from the shoreline by the tide, and they started crying for mom to come. And the wolves heard first, and they were able to sort of ambush and kill these cubs before the mom was able to get back to them. So opportunistic instances like that allow wolves to, kill some of the younger brown bear cubs. And it's likely that they also scavenge the bodies of dead adults as well. Now, it's going to start to get really exciting because we see that these wolves are eating a ton of salmon. In fact, 1/4 of the wolf scats that we analyzed successfully contained salmon DNA. That's 151 scats, 151 instances in which wolves ate salmon. We know from previous studies in British Columbia and Southeast Alaska that wolves and many other terrestrial carnivores eat a lot of salmon when they run upstream in the summer, but this was much higher than we were expecting for this area. And I showed this video already, but we knew from the camera trap videos already that we were going to see wolves eating salmon. Now, I've separated salmon into its own bin for this figure because it's a very seasonally discrete resource, but it's important to note here that if you group all of the fish into one category, it would comprise the most common summer diet item for these coastal wolves because we also detected a variety of oceanic fish species in wolf diets. This is really interesting because the range of species represented here is huge and suggests that wolves are getting ocean fish in a lot of different ways. Some of these smaller species, like the sticklebacks and the sculpin, might be consumed either as marine mammal stomach contents or caught directly in the tide pools in the rocky intertidal zone, just while wolves are foraging there. Species like starry flounder and crescent gunnel are definitely being fished for actively. In fact, we've seen both bears and wolves on our cameras getting starry flounder in the middle of the night, usually at the river mouths when they come into the shallow areas. And bigger fish like halibut are most likely consumed when they wash up dead on the beach because it's hard to imagine wolves getting them any other way. We detected a variety of seabirds in wolf diet. As with the fishes, this is most likely a combination of scavenging and hunting. The most commonly detected bird in wolf diet by far was actually cormorants, which makes sense considering that there are some nesting cormorant colonies in these coastal areas where the wolves live. We also see that wolves are eating other marine mammals like seals and sea lions. This is substantiated by an observation that the park's coastal biologist Kelsey actually had of a lone wolf killing a harbor seal. And in the upper right-hand corner, this photo is from that observation. She watched this single wolf fight for about 20 minutes with a harbor seal that had hauled out too far from the shore, and then the tide went out. The wolf was able to grab it by its tail and kind of pull it into shallow water and eventually kill it and eat it there. And then it left and came back with another one of its pack members to share the meal. This other photo is a wolf feeding on a sea lion carcass, and we don't know whether that was a kill that it made or whether the carcass was just washed up on the beach. We detected 3 different species of whale in wolf diet on the Katmai Coast that summer. And this was pretty cool because the species actually matched up with the carcasses that we saw at different field sites. So up at Kamishak, our northernmost field sites, there was a humpback whale carcass that washed up on the beach. And sure enough, when we analyzed some of the wolf scats from there, we were detecting humpback whale DNA in them. And we staked out this carcass and actually got a little video of the wolf snatching a piece of the whale and pulling it over to eat by itself. And this wolf was super bold. It actually went up and took part of the carcass while 13 adult male brown bears were also feeding on the carcass. So that's a pretty cool demonstration of how an abundance of prey can facilitate coexistence between these top carnivores that might otherwise compete with one another. And a variety of other prey items were also present, including red foxes, porcupines, birds, rodents, snowshoe hare, river otter, and weasels. Now, we know that marine invertebrates are also a part of wolf diet, and we're in the process of optimizing metabarcoding methods to target these marine invertebrate species within scats. Right now, our current assay only works for distinguishing vertebrate prey species, but we'll get to the marine vertebrates eventually. But just based on sort of picking up the scats and looking through them, we see clamshells, blue mussels pretty often. And also this leftmost photo here is a scat that was comprised almost entirely of the exoskeletal tubes of feather duster worms, which are available to wolves in the tide pools, but also wash up in these big balls on the beach that smell really fishy. So my hunch is that the wolves, while they're walking down the beach, might take a bite of one of those because they smell appetizing to them. And last, but definitely not least, we see this incredible amount of sea otter in wolf diet. About 1/3 of the wolf scats that we analyzed contained sea otter DNA. It was their most common prey item. So that's pretty amazing. And it begs the question, how do wolves get sea otters? Now, there's definitely a lot of scavenging happening. Sea otters are at carrying capacity on the Katmai coast, and thus they wash up dead on the beach pretty often. But we were also lucky enough last summer to see wolves hunt and kill, or it wasn't last summer, 2 summers ago, to see wolves hunt and kill a sea otter. We were staking out a specific rock scurry that was just offshore and accessible by a sand spit at low tide for several days in order to hopefully observe wolves hunting there. We knew that they had been checking it because every morning when we'd get up, we saw their tracks on the beach going out to this island. We had also seen otters hauling out on this island before, so we knew it was a good stage to be watching for this interaction. And one morning we got really lucky and we saw 3 wolves work together to kill the sea otter, ostensibly by ambushing it and cutting off its escape route back to the water. And we investigated the kill site immediately afterwards. I ran out there before the tide could come in to try and get samples and whatnot. And all that was left behind of the otter was the mandible and the liver. And it was really interesting that they left the liver because that's usually something that the wolves will eat. So we collected that, put it on ice, and got it analyzed. And we initially had it analyzed for mercury because we were thinking, oh, mercury bioaccumulation could be a reason why a predator would not eat that part. But the mercury levels came back pretty normal. So then we got it analyzed for paralytic shellfish poisoning, and it actually came back with really high paralytic shellfish poisoning toxicity. So that was really cool. The wolf probably tasted that and took a bite and decided not to eat it because of that. And it's sort of interesting to think about how paralytic shellfish poisoning might be mediating this interaction between wolves and otters a bit, as well as mediating the foraging and haul out behavior of otters and other marine mammals. When we look at the overall contribution of marine and terrestrial prey items to wolf diet in coastal Katmai, we see that at 5 out of 6 of our coastal sites, wolves were getting more than half of their meals from the marine system. So these findings really challenge our assumptions about what wolves eat and what they need in their environment to survive. There are several packs of wolves on the Katmai coast that seem to be thriving despite the relative absence of their traditional primary prey options from this system. Wolves are not always obligate ungulate predators. They're generalists with extremely flexible diets. They're very opportunistic and are able to take advantage of this shifting mosaic of resource availability in both space and time. Sea otters in particular may be supporting highly successful wolf populations in areas where we might not expect wolves to be able to survive based on our traditional assumptions about their diet. Now I'm going to shift gears here to talking about the second phase of this research, which was an expansion of the study to include samples from another coastal wolf population in a neighboring national park. Lake Clark National Park and Preserve is located further north up Katmai, up the Cook Inlet from Katmai. And we thought that sampling the coastal wolf population there next would provide an interesting point of comparison for the coastal wolf diet in Katmai, particularly because there's a different suite of available prey species between the two parks. Our main point of interest here is that sea otter recolonization is still progressing northwards up the Cook Inlet, and sea otters are only just beginning to establish themselves on the Lake Clark coast. However, there are also some other differences. For example, black bears and coyotes are both present in Lake Clark and absent from Katmai. Like Katmai, Lake Clark's coastline also provides ample access to other marine resources like intertidal invertebrates, seabirds, and fish, including salmon. So last summer, we again got dropped off on remote locations on the Lake Clark coast by these very small planes and camped at a variety of gorgeous and sometimes super muddy field sites. We tried to cover as much of the coastline as possible in search of the scats, which was a bit less daunting of a task this time, given that the Lake Clark coastline is about 1/3 the length of Katmai's coast. We were again able to find some den and rendezvous sites, although it became clear to us pretty quickly as we explored more of the coastline that Lake Clark just didn't seem to have quite as many wolf packs as Katmai. This map here shows the locations, again, of all the scats that we collected, but many of them ended up being coyote and lynx scats. So we only ended up with around 105 coastal wolf scats in total. That's just, the scats that passed all of our quality control filtering and contained both wolf and vertebrate prey DNA. So there were more scats to begin with, but 105 were ultimately what we were able to include in our diet analysis. Now, the average prey items per scat was actually almost identical between the two parks, which was cool to see. But we only detected 36 unique prey species in the Lake Clark wolf diets compared to the 67 that we detected in Katmai. So it's very possible that this big difference is just due to the fact that we had more than 5 times as many scats collected from the Katmai coast, and we're also covering a bigger spatial range with our field sites there. So in the absence of the hyperabundance of sea otters, we found that predictably moose are the most common prey item for Lake Clark wolves. They were detected in almost half of the scats we collected. The second, third, and fourth most common prey categories were birds and small rodents, which is pretty expected. Now we can see that the top 6 most common prey categories for Lake Clark coastal wolves are all coming from the terrestrial system, which is already very different than the breakdown for the Katmai wolves. But we do have some fish showing up here I was actually surprised that we didn't see more salmon in wolf diet for the Lake Clark coast because there's a ton of really healthy salmon runs there. But I think that could have just had to do with the time that we were sampling and also maybe the run dynamics that year. It's from year to year, this number of available salmon can vary pretty widely. So could be that. This is my opportunity to brag about the giant silver salmon I caught. There's my photo of it. We got to eat it in the field. But anyway, I suspect that, we didn't detect as many salmon in the wolf diet here because we ended our field season before most of the runs had reached their peak. Now, really interestingly, we did detect 2 scats with sea otter at one of our field sites, Shelter Creek, and also detected harbor seal and some scats from that same site as well. So this was exciting to see, of course, and it's also most likely that this was a sea otter carcass that washed up by chance on the shore there rather than an individual that had been predated, although we can't know that for sure. It was exciting because it shows that wolves are taking advantage of marine mammals as soon as they show up on the scene, even if it isn't necessarily a predictable part of their environment, at least within, the living memory of an individual wolf. Maybe they've never seen sea otter before, but they're still able to identify it as a good prey option as soon as it's available. And I actually spoke with a biologist up in Alaska recently who said that they're seeing a lot more sea otter off the Lake Clark coast already. So I'm hoping to get some additional sampling done there this summer to sort of see whether they are in real time utilizing more and more sea otters as they become more common off the coast there. Our remaining detections were similar. They were similar to the filler species that we saw in Katmai. So more beaver, snowshoe hare, porcupine, red fox, and birds. But also interestingly, we detected some marten DNA in Lake Clark wolf scats. I really like martens, so this was cool to see. And also, I did not know that wolves ate martens. So it was interesting to detect that relationship as well. Now, this figure shows a comparison of some of the major diet categories for Katmai versus Lake Clark coastal wolves. I like this visualization because you can really see how different the foraging strategies are for wolves between the two parks. The main large-bodied prey option that is being taken advantage of in Katmai is, of course, the sea otters, whereas in Lake Clark, it's the moose. The more typical strategy we would expect of wolves. We also see some prey items that are unique to each park. So Lake Clark has black bears, like I mentioned, and the wolves are definitely eating some black bears when they're available. In fact, we've heard anecdotes that they'll even dig them out of their dens. while Katmai has Arctic ground squirrels, which aren't, they don't exist as far north as Lake Clark for whatever reason. So the Katmai wolves have access to that unique prey item as well. So if you just look at the color composition of these two diet figures for each park side by side, it's pretty striking how different the marine resource utilization is for each wolf population. Lake Clark coastal wolves are definitely fishing and eating other marine prey when they come across them, but these Katmai wolves are truly sea wolves in the sense that they have focused their hunting and foraging strategy around taking advantage of the marine system, particularly the seasonal salmon runs and high abundance of sea otters. Now, I hope that someone, perhaps even me, will have the opportunity to conduct this same study again in maybe 20 years. I predict that as the sea otter population expansion progresses northwards and otters recolonize the Lake Clark coast, which apparently is happening pretty rapidly now, the Lake Clark wolves will change their foraging strategy to take advantage of this nutritionally dense, large-bodied prey item and start to rely more on the marine system as well. Now, I want to talk briefly about the genotyping data. We have so far detected at least 32 unique individual wolves living on the Katmai coast. Now, this number, 32, is just the number of individuals that we have detected more than once. So there are several genotypes that have only been detected once, and I'm hesitant at this point to trust that those are truly unique wolves and not representative of some error in our process. So I'm going to resequence all of those samples just to confirm that they are indeed unique wolves. But there very well could be as many as 40 or even more unique wolves living out on the Katmai coast. Furthermore, these wolves are assembled into at least 6 distinct packs. So 6 packs, 40 wolves, 30 to 40 wolves. This is really shockingly high wolf density for a 500-mile coastline, especially considering that there aren't any deer or caribou herds available on the coast there, which is, typically thought of as necessary to support high wolf density. And it's also worth mentioning that if you remember, I'm not going to flip all the way back to it, but the map that showed all the different sites that we sampled on the Katmai coast, there's large gaps, 50 plus mile sections of coastlines that we didn't sample that could very well contain additional wolf packs. So they're really densely packed in there, neighboring with one another. It's a unique sort of population structure even for coastal wolves. My hypothesis is that access to sea otters on the Katmai coast is supporting this super high wolf density, and that sea otter recolonization, which again is due to our human conservation intervention to help restore their population, has also restored a historic food web linkage between wolves and the marine system that has likely existed across the Gulf of Alaska for hundreds, if not thousands of years before the fur trade. Now, if sea otter recolonization is subsidizing coastal wolf populations like it seems to be doing in Katmai, this has potential cascading impacts for both the marine and terrestrial ecosystems. Otters are a keystone marine predator that is well known to regulate nearshore communities by putting predation pressure on the marine invertebrate prey species that they consume. It seems unlikely that wolf predation would be enough to limit the huge sea otter populations, but any effects that wolves might have on sea otters could potentially have cascading implications for the marine system due to the importance of sea otters as a top predator. On the terrestrial side of things, we can imagine how increased wolf populations and these super densely packed, wolf packs in coastal areas due to the utilization of sea otters might have broader implications for ungulate communities. For example, moose communities in Southwest or in Southeast Alaska, Sitka black-tailed deer, for example. When wolves are only eating moose, that's one thing. But when wolves eat both moose and sea otters, their populations might be able to grow to a greater abundance than we would see for a population with no access to marine resources. And that's when the phenomenon of apparent competition might take place. So apparent competition between sea otters and ungulate prey in this instance is a potential consequence when a growing wolf population gets so large that they are able to consume moose or deer enough to cause a decline in their population. So Gretchen Roffler, who I mentioned earlier with Alaska Fish and Game, her coastal wolf study in the Alexander Archipelago in Southeast has actually shown that this phenomenon of apparent competition might already be taking place for the wolf pack on Pleasant Island that she's studying there. this wolf pack on Pleasant Island is eating a ton of sea otter. And as the wolf population on the island has grown, Gretchen has measured a decline in the Sitka black-tailed deer population, which is now nearly extinct on the island. They did some pellet counts to deer poop pellet counts to estimate them, and they weren't able to find any deer poop in the past few years. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I'm in the process of genotyping the Lake Clark wolf scats. We don't know how many wolves there are there yet, but I would predict that it's substantially fewer than on the Katmai coast. And again, I hypothesize that that is because the wolves in Lake Clark don't have access to this sea otter, seasonally available, nutritionally dense, large-bodied prey option. So for the next phase of the project, I'll be focusing in further on the sea otter side of the story here. I'm going to be attempting to use that genotyping by SNPs method to identify individual sea otters within wolf scats, which if it works, it's a big if, it's going to be kind of difficult, but if it does work, we would be able to count the number of unique individual sea otters that a wolf pack or even an individual wolf is eating over the course of a summer season. And this would allow us to get some more specific numbers that we could use to estimate the potential numerical impacts of a wolf pack's predation on the sea otter population, and would also tell us how many sea otters are necessary to support a wolf pack as their primary prey option over the course of a summer season. So if you want any more information about this, feel free to contact me, ask questions at the end, or I also have 2 Q&As that I did with the Park Service actually while I was doing the field work. If you want to hear more anecdotes, stories from the field, you might want to check those out. They're both on YouTube. If you just Google Ellen Dymit wolves, they will come up there. And yes, thank you again, everybody, for being here. I'm excited to take questions. Thank you to everybody who's been a part of this ongoing work. It's a blast. It's a dream come true for me, of course. And feel free to email me or follow me on Twitter. I'm pretty active there. So yeah.
Thanks, Ellen. That was fantastic. And it's just fascinating being from a landlocked state of Minnesota and thinking about all of the other kind of prey options and density dependent options that are available on the coast, and the opportunistic part of wolves when we're used to they certainly eat other things, but the primary focus is on ungulates and deer in our area. And so just super, super interesting. So thank you. And we do have some questions. So just for a reminder for everyone who has joined us, you can type in your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So just click on that and type in your question, and then I will ask them out loud for Ellen to answer for us live. So one of the questions that we have is from June, who's also in Oregon. And what other kinds of oceanic fish, apart from the salmon, have you seen wolves typically eat?
Yeah, it really is. I think that we had detected as many as 11 different species of oceanic fish. The most common one that we see is sculpin. And the region of the DNA that we read for our metabarcoding assay is not very good at distinguishing small fish from one another. So we're only able to get some of them to genus level identified, but it seems like there's a bunch of these smaller tide pool sculpin species that they're getting. And I looked at whether we were seeing those small fish in the same scats as seal DNA or otter DNA, because that might suggest that the wolf ate the stomach of a seal or a sea otter and got the fish that way. And surprisingly, we often see scats that are just small fish DNA, as if that were the entire meal for the wolf, which suggests that they are going into these tide pools and actually catching the little fish somehow, which I would really love to catch that on a camera trap or something. It would be so cool to see. And then I think I mentioned a lot of the flatfish like flounder and dabs are showing up pretty often. I wonder whether they're just easy to see and to catch in shallow water. Wolves use that same sort of dash and grab method that you'll see brown bears do for catching fish in shallow water. So that would be how they're getting them. And then something that we also see often is 3-spined stickleback, which is another really small fish. That is probably something that they're also getting from the tide pools, and crescent gunnels, which gunnelfish are in shallow, sandy water, mudflat type areas. So that's another thing that they could be fishing for actively.
Awesome. Thank you. Do you know what kind of subspecies of gray wolf that you have been studying are, and are they the same subspecies that could be found on the Aleutian Islands?
Yeah, so there is a lot of sort of debate about whether coastal wolves should, in Southwest Alaska in particular, should be designated as their own subspecies. The more I learn about genetics, the more I sort of tend to fall into the camp of like a lot of species distinctions we make are arbitrary, and it becomes a good idea to create a new subspecies designation for an animal when you want that subspecies to be conserved or preserved for some reason. So for example, with wolves, the Alexander Archipelago wolves were designated as their own subspecies, which allowed us to petition them for listing, separate from, the larger gray wolf question. So there are people who would say that the wolves that I work with are like Canis lupus maritimus, like their own kind of sea wolf subspecies, but I tend to think of them as just gray wolves. One sort of interesting aside, doesn't really have to do with your question, but all of the wolves on the Katmai coast are light colored. So we don't have any like black or like dark gray or even dark brown wolves. They're all like white and sand colored, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I wonder sometimes whether that could be whether that's truly random or whether that could be some sort of ecotype that's arisen over time with these wolves living in like beachy, sandy sort of coastal environments.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Kind of based on just the general weather and climate that there is in that area. And then, studying wolves and animals from other areas. Are you seeing other kind of physical adaptations that you can physically see on them that is helping them to survive in those environments and hunt and live on coastal areas compared to maybe more forested non-coastal areas?
Yeah, well, they're good at catching fish. They're like really good at catching fish. Actually, they rarely miss. It's interesting when you watch them fish the salmon run, they catch almost everything that they go for. They have the same success rate as like the bigger brown bears do, which is pretty amazing. It's not like, to me, it suggests that that's something that's kind of always been in their nature, to be able to catch fish. Also, not a lot of people know wolves have webbed feet, so they're actually sort of built to be good swimmers already. And there have been some GPS collared wolves in Southeast Alaska that have swam as far as 8 kilometers to get out to an island. So they have the endurance to go really far offshore if they're motivated to go out there and look for prey, which, in Southwest Alaska a motivator might be to get to a rookery for marine mammals or to get to like a seabird nesting colony or something where they could just chow down on unsuspecting prey for days and days and days. But the Katmai coastal wolves are also a little bit smaller bodied than some of the wolves that we would see in like more interior regions. And I can't really speak to why that might be, but it's probably, or it could be something that has arisen from them historically targeting smaller prey, not, going after caribou herds, but catching things like otters.
Sure. Yeah, that's super interesting. So at the International Wolf Center, we have 5 ambassador wolves that live in our exhibit, and we have a pond with a small stream that circulates the water in there. And occasionally for enrichment, we have put minnows in the pond for them to hunt and go after. And the smaller fish, they just aren't able to see or find or whatever their struggles with that are. But when they've been a little bit bigger, there is a pretty distinct learning curve for them to figure out looking at that fish and the depth perception before they're able to actually catch one. So I'd be interested in just watching wolves in this area just kind of do that or learn as pups or however they're learning how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
How long does it usually take for you once you have kind of set up the cameras and the snares and have that all set up before the wolves are showing up? And do you have a crew of people, or is it kind of just maybe you and somebody else?
Yeah, so it's usually me and one tech, and I always hire a friend because you don't want to end up in remote Alaska with somebody who you don't know very well. And we the first thing we do when we get on the ground is set up our hair snares, because we often do have to move them. And most of the time we have to move them because they're getting too much bear attention and it just becomes impossible to maintain them. But I would say if there are wolves in the area that are going to hit the hair snare, it happens within the first 2 days. Like almost every time it happens within the first check. And if within the first check we haven't gotten any attention, it's very unlikely that we will, get a wolf to come later in the week. So we set usually 2 snares per site. And if, after 2 or 3 days, neither of them have been visited, or they're being visited by too many bears, then we'll move them.
Awesome. Great.
Mm-hmm.
And there are quite a few comments about how fascinating and great this presentation was. So we all thank you again. And have you become familiar with any specific wolf or specific wolf packs that you've kind of seen repeatedly, and where it kind of became recognizable at those locations?
Yeah. Yes. I do. I mean, there were some places where we would see the wolves literally every single day sometimes, which is just crazy when you think about, how hard it is in like the average person's lifetime to see any wolves at all. And there was one super large white, like snow white male that was actually one of the wolves we saw killed a sea otter that we had been watching. And he was very bold. Like he would see us sitting on the beach and would kind of stop and look at us and maybe even come towards us sometimes. We were calling him Storm. I think other people have other names for him too, because he's sort of like famous for being the breeding male at that area. And he is the one oh gosh, I have a photo of him somewhere in this presentation. He's the one who's eating the sea lion carcass in this picture right here in the lower left. So he's one of my favorites. And then the breeding female at the Dakavac pack, we had a really cool interaction with her too, where we were walking on the beach and she came down onto the beach. And we could see that she was the breeding female because you could see all of her nipples, and she had clearly had nursing puppies, like they were like very dangly. And she came down to the beach and like paused for a second when she saw us. And then she just like flopped down in the sand right in front of us and took a nap because she was so exhausted, probably from mothering all of the puppies. And she's just like, I need to get away from the kids for a little while. I'm going to go down to the beach and take a nap. So I really connected with her. I thought that was a cool wolf interaction as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then are you choosing the more non-invasive methods to not collar, so you're avoiding physical contact with the wolves, or is it just part of the research strategy that you're using for this study?
So I mean, I'm not like anti-collaring by any means. I think movement data is really cool to work with, but I think that in these national parks, it's better to not collar for a couple of reasons. The first is, like I mentioned, when you start darting wolves from helicopters, they learn to be afraid of helicopters and people. And when there's so many, bear viewing tourists like landing small planes on the beach, it's better if the wolves aren't afraid of those things, because once they become afraid of aviation, then it's gonna, mess up every single day for them, because there's planes landing on the beach every single day at some of these locations. The other thing is that not only is it really expensive to collar wolves, but it's really logistically difficult in coastal ecosystems, because when you dart a wolf, you then have to land the plane and get to the tranquilized wolf in order to work with it. And if you dart a wolf and it runs a little bit and it passes out in the water, like while it's crossing the river, it might drown. It might, be dead by the time you get to it. Or if it passes out in the woods and then it takes you, 40 minutes to land the plane and get all your gear and hike up to the wolf, by the time you get to it, the drug might be wearing off. And there's just like all of these complications for, given the limitation of landing the plane, landing the helicopter, and all the water in these coastal ecosystems that make it really dangerous to dart any animals there. I mean, they do bear captures, but it's like a whole summer will go by with them trying constantly, and they'll only catch like 3 bears, because they just have to be so careful and deliberate about when they're darting them.
Sure, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
How do you expect kind of the diet composition of these wolves to vary across seasons?
I just got approval from my advisor to do a winter field season out on the Katmai coast. And I don't have any of the logistics figured out yet, but that has been my number one question is, are they continuing to eat these marine mammals all throughout, the winter? And the coast in these areas they don't get like a ton of snow. Like it doesn't become very compacted with snow and ice. Some ice flows will come through though. So there's, on the one hand, sea otters breed year round also. So there'd be pups available all the time. And on the one hand, wolves might be able to go out onto the ice and more easily catch some of these marine mammals just because there's more kind of stages for them to haul out on. And also during winter storm cycles, we see marine mammals haul out more often to conserve energy. So it could be that there are increased opportunities to catch these, large marine prey in the wintertime. But on the flip side, you don't have the salmon run. So that, the absence of that super important nutritious resource might incentivize wolves to, move further inland to get to where the ungulates are more, or I don't know. We don't really know. It's just so hard logistically to do, any sort of work in Southwest Alaska on the coast in the wintertime. But if I had to predict, I would maybe even venture to guess that we would see increased marine resource utilization, at least marine mammal utilization in the wintertime for these wolf packs. Because I don't think that I don't think it would make sense for them to go across the mountains to get to the caribou herds as long as they still have seals and sea otters.
Sure. And we will all be waiting for the results of that study because that sounds super cool.
Mm-hmm.
If so, kind of going along with that, but also just in general, if sea otters are the primary food source or one of their primary food sources, do you think that has an effect on the size of the wolves now? Are they maybe smaller than wolves in other areas that are eating moose or elk or caribou or whatever it happens to be? And do you think that might change over time?
Yeah, I mean, it's so like on one thing to think about is that like these wolf populations have been in the area probably, sea otters have also been there like pre-fur trade historically. So if there was going to be some big like body size increase as a result of the wolves eating a ton of sea otter, that might have already happened historically. But we don't actually weigh any of our wolves, and the only reason I mentioned that they tend to be smaller than the interior wolves is just based on anecdote of me and the other field members. Like we'll see the breeding female and we'll be like, wow, she looks really tiny compared to, Denali wolves, for example, or like North Slope wolves or something like that. I also don't have as good of an understanding of like animal physiology to understand how evolutionarily prey size impacts body size or shapes body size. But I will say that the biggest wolves we see on the Katmai coast are consistently the breeding males, which is consistent with what we would expect from like wolf biology in general. Like the big, capable hunters are the ones who are going to rise as the breeding individuals for the pack.
Sure, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Have you, I don't know if this is part of your study, so maybe, but it's a great question. Where prey density is high in other areas, particularly Yellowstone and some other areas, multiple females in a pack are sometimes, there are multiple females in a pack that are having pups in the same season. Have you seen that happening in that area?
So oh my gosh. Okay. I was actually thinking about this today because right now I'm in the process of like mapping all of the genotype scats. And something that I'm noticing is that we have two sites that are, adjacent to one another on the coast. They're separated by a mountain ridge. And at each site, we found a den that had pup scat at both of them. So we know that there were two den sites with two different litters of puppies. But now that I'm plotting the scat locations, the genotype scat locations, I'm seeing a lot of overlap in the wolf packs. Like they're going kind of back and forth from one another's territories. So I'm sort of wondering, what is the deal with that? Like, is it that this is one big group of like closely related wolves that has had two females breed, and they've taken different den sites that are, separate but still close to one another, and are, because they're closely related, the sort of territoriality has broken down a bit between them? Or could it be that they are, more distinct, not super closely related wolf packs, and that territoriality is breaking down a bit because there's such an abundance of food that we're starting to see, that things like maintaining a territory don't become as important of an investment of your energy because there's enough food to go around for everyone, which is something that you see with like male jaguars in like the Pantanal, for example. Like they hang out with one another, which jaguars are usually super territorial, and they do that because there's so many fish. So could it be that the Katmai coastal wolves are either having multiple breedings per pack because of the availability of otters, or there is a breakdown in traditional like territoriality behavior that is, facilitating this sort of exchange of individuals between one another's territories? But I don't know yet. I have to ask me again in 2 weeks, and maybe I'll have a better answer for you then.
Awesome. Well, we have a couple of requests. We want the follow-up presentation, so we'll ask you that.
Awesome.
Does the paralytic shellfish toxins affect other sea mammals that the wolves consume? And does it affect the wolves if they had, I guess I don't know much about it. So if they had eaten the liver of that particular critter, would it had an adverse effect on the wolf?
Yeah. So I've been sort of diving into the literature on that ever since we got those results back for the liver. And there's an interesting study from the 80s where they had sea otters in these like exclosure pens out in the ocean, and they basically force fed them paralytic shellfish infested mussels or clams rather. And what they do when half of the clams have PSP and half of them are healthy clams, the otters will pick up the unhealthy ones and immediately like recognize that they have toxin, like they can taste the toxin in it, and then they'll just discard them, or they'll eat the body, but they'll discard the siphon of the clam, which is usually where the toxin is concentrated. But when they're forced to only eat, like when they're only given clams that have the toxin in them and they have nothing else to eat and they eat that, there are changes in their behavior. They'll haul out more often. Their swimming sort of becomes discoordinated. And there was one individual who ate like a ton of toxic clams in this study who just by the end of it was like sitting up on her island and just like screaming, apparently. So clearly in distress. So there are very obvious neurological issues that arise when you reach like really high levels of PSP toxicity, but animals seem to know how to avoid it. And the wolves discarding the liver is an example of that. And, the otters discarding siphons, which has also been seen in the wild in Alaska, that behavior is also a sign of them recognizing and avoiding it. So it kind of becomes a question of like, how insidious is the exposure to PSP? Like, is it throughout their lifetime? If they have enough of these small doses that are unrecognizable, can that accumulate to a level of, toxicity that would lead to psychological or neurological distress for the animal? And that's not really known yet. At least from my literature search, it seems like there hasn't been enough like long-term monitoring of PSP exposure in animals yet, but it's definitely something that the research community is really interested in now, because our, chemistry and molecular methods for monitoring stuff like that have advanced so much in the past decade. So hopefully we'll understand that better now. And I am, hoping in my lifetime to get more into those questions as well and look at things like bioaccumulation of PSP and other toxins like mercury in these coastal carnivores, not just wolves, but also the bears that are eating a lot of these clams as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be really interesting. And just the last couple of questions. Do you have any of your data published?
So I am working on my first author paper right now. My goal is to submit the manuscript by the end of the summer. So we'll see. And then we have in review a paper that details some of the observations of these predation events. So the sea otter, the seal that we saw killed. And then we also have in that paper some camera trap data where we captured wolves visiting the haul outs looking for prey, or wolves with otter carcasses coming back from islands. And that will, fingers crossed, hopefully be available soon. and it will be published in the Scientific Naturalist, which is an ecology journal.
Fantastic. The last couple of questions I'm going to kind of lump together. So there's just general interest, of course, in this like super fascinating topic. And so first question is, are there any opportunities for learning more, potentially participating in research that's happening with coastal wolves? And then the second part of that is, what are your tips for somebody who is just starting out in this field and this just sounds fascinating?
Yeah, well, I am not going to be, well, I mean, at least in the duration of my PhD, I probably won't do any more substantial like field trips where I'm not tagging along. So my winter work, I'll probably be tagging along with an existing bird survey operation that's going to be happening in the wintertime in Alaska. So I can't really speak to opportunities with me for field work, but in general, in Alaska, and especially on like the NOAA side of things, so they're very focused on marine mammals, there are opportunities to study sort of the sea otter and seal sides of that interactions. They often hire technicians kind of year round for help with those sorts of projects. There's also been sort of a wave of interest in coastal wolves in British Columbia. So I think that if you're like a prospective grad student or even somebody who's looking for teching positions, you might want to look at like the University of British Columbia, the University of Victoria, who have researchers who are starting sort of new camera trapping or metabarcoding based diet studies for wolves on the coast there. And then in terms of general advice, don't be, I mean, my big thing I like to tell people is that I didn't take a single genetics course until graduate school. So all of the methods that I'm using, I learned within the last 3 years. And at the beginning, I was so intimidated. I was like, oh, I really want to work on this project. I love wolves so much, but I don't know if I have, you know, the chops to do the molecular work. But it was totally possible for me to learn it. So it's never too late to learn a new skill, and don't be intimidated by the quantitative side of things. Like if something seems really mathy or really like science heavy and it seems, you know, scary, like don't be scared, because you will be able to figure it out. And there are people all over the world who will help you. And also I would say that for graduate school, like prospective graduate students, try and find a project that is in collaboration with a land management agency like the Park Service or Fish and Wildlife, or even if you go to a university for undergrad or graduate school that is like a land grant institution, because those are the sort of projects that are going to have the funding capacity for really big, really cool field work, like what I get to do in Alaska and what, you know, other people in my lab group are getting to do all throughout the Western United States. And yeah, so those collaborative partnerships are a really important part of field heavy PhD master's type projects.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Ellen, again, there's lots of comments about that it was a great presentation and super interesting. And I bet the views out there were spectacular. So we are all looking forward to the follow-up presentation where we can answer all of our greatest questions. And thank you again to everyone who joined us tonight. And thank you so much, Ellen, for presenting on this really great topic. It was super, super interesting.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for hosting me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.